Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Less than 2 months after Donald Trump took office, his administration announced that it was doing away with the Environmental Protection Agency offices that were charged with addressing the disproportionately high levels of pollution in poor communities. Studies have shown that residents of these communities have higher rates of asthma, heart disease, and other health problems when compared with the national average. What will this mean for the people who live in these communities, which in New York are predominantly Black and Hispanic, and for those who have spent decades trying to bring environmental justice to their neighborhoods? Here to discuss these issues is Eddie Bautista, Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Its mission is to highlight the key environmental justice issues affecting multiple communities and to involve those affected in leadership roles to help resolve them. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So what exactly do we mean when we're talking about environmental justice?
Sure. Environmental justice is now an international movement by low-income people of color, against the disparities of environmental impacts, against negative public health disparities, and really it's a movement that has been fighting for its environmental equity and dignity to kind of live a life free, or not free, at least without a disproportionate impact and exposure to environmental harm.
And we're really talking about man-made factors that make life less healthy and less livable for people, right? We're not talking about natural things. We're talking about things that we have done. Sure,
and it's a range of exposures, right? Everything from from having disproportionate numbers of bus depots in a community, or a disproportionate number of waste transfer stations or power plants. These are all kind of man-made and infrastructure-driven exposures of toxic air, for example, right? And then there are day-to-day products that people use in their homes that all too often contain harmful chemicals that people are not aware of and kind of blissfully use. And when you look at all of these different environmental exposures and impacts, it's no wonder that you have a disparity of public health indicia on top of kind of these disparities of environmental impacts.
Because you're talking about things like rates of asthma,
right,
and
absolutely,
perhaps respiratory ailments, and other, maybe cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with asthma, which is like the most popularly known way of how disproportionate environmental impacts land on people, right? There've been numerous studies, everyone from the New York State Controller to NYU have done multiple studies that have shown Black and Latino children, for example, being twice as likely to be exposed to asthma. If you look at the Bronx specifically, again, different studies by NYU and the New York State Controller have shown that Bronx children are 3 times as likely to be exposed to asthma, 5 times as likely to be hospitalized for it, and 3 times as likely, or twice as likely to die from asthma than the national average. And if you look at a number of public health indicia like that, it maps pretty clearly where the more people of color or the more low-income people you have in a community, the likelier that these disparities show up.
And I was reading somewhere that nearly the entire borough of the Bronx qualifies as an environmental justice area.
Yeah, absolutely. There was we passed a law a few years ago. In fact, it was the state climate law for New York State, which is the most ambitious climate law among the 50 states. One of the things that law generated was this category of what's called disadvantaged communities. Part of the law is to make sure that these communities are getting their fair share of investments from the state and from a range of public sector sources. And one of those was this designation of what's called disadvantaged communities. I was part of the climate justice working group that came up with the criteria for which communities meet that challenge or not. And yet, like almost the entire Bronx, with the exception of Riverdale, it can be classified as a disadvantaged community.
And other specific communities, East Harlem, is one.
Yes.
Central and Eastern Brooklyn. What neighborhoods would those
Absolutely.
that comprise?
These are all, Central Brooklyn. In fact, if you look at how a range of ways where disparities have shown up for our communities, if you look at, go back to the 60s and 70s, from the late 60s to the late 70s, you had well over 600,000 apartments that were lost due to the fires that were prevalent in the Bronx, throughout the Bronx, northern Manhattan, and central Brooklyn. And again, these are some of the same neighborhoods that have a disparity when it comes to green space and park space.
Right.
They are disproportionately vulnerable when it comes to heat exposure, which we should talk about, because with climate change, on top of the usual environmental disparities, now we have all the expected impacts from climate change, and we're finding that those are disproportionately showing up in Black and Latino communities as well.
Now, why would there be more heat exposure in Black and Latino communities than in other communities?
It's a variety of reasons, right? So go back to what we were talking about before, like where most of the fires happened, right? Most of the fires happened in predominantly Black and Latino communities from the late 60s to the late 70s. And when these communities were ultimately rebuilt, a lot of the rebuilding was focused on the housing infrastructure, but things like open space, things like green infrastructure,
right.
things that we need in order to deal with the urban heat island effect. We find that our communities are lacking, whether it's cooling centers, whether it's green infrastructure, the amenities that make some communities cooler rather than others that are warmer.
Yeah.
Those are also along clearly distinct racial and demographic categories.
You talk about the impact of the fires and having to rebuild in those particular neighborhoods. But what were the other factors historically
Absolutely.
that made these neighborhoods come to be environmental justice areas,
Absolutely.
or environmental injustice areas, you might call them?
Absolutely. So it really is the story of infrastructure and how the built environment evolved over the decades, right? Some people can rightfully trace environmental racism back to the slave quarters and how indigenous people were wiped out in the early years and decades of the country's founding. But in the modern era, environmental justice first really started showing up, meaning activists started connecting exposure to environmental harm to public health, started showing up in activist ways by the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. When you look at their breakfast programs and you look at the lead programs that they fought for, all of these were expressions of how the environment was not serving the people in these communities equitably. So if you look at, for example, beyond the fires, if you look at redlining, which is a historic practice by banks and insurance companies where they literally drew red lines around certain communities and would deem them, bad investment, bad risks on return. And what that meant was you had entire neighborhoods where property owners were not able to get loans and mortgages in order to kind of, get their buildings up to, the proper grade or whatever, right? So these are the kinds of, whether it's redlining, whether it's the zoning, the way zoning would happen in New York City, a lot of where these polluting kind of systems of infrastructure are located are housed and located in these communities because our communities tend to have a disproportionate amount of mixed zoning, whether it's industrial or other commercial uses.
So you'd have factories and you'd have, I guess, electrical power plants, and you'd have sewage treatment plants,
waste transfer stations, all that stuff. And what happened was, as middle class and whiter, well-off communities in New York City, as they understood how to rezone their communities, they did so. And they did so zoning out noxious uses, zoning down so that you can't build up and have higher density communities. So the history of zoning in New York City has a long, shameful history of disproportionately using the zoning laws to benefit whiter or richer communities than communities of color.
Yeah.
And this is the legacy we've been fighting against.
Lack of public transportation is another issue in this whole environmental justice area. Talk to me about that.
What's really interesting is, and it's also combined with the political moment we find ourselves in with the incoming Mamdani administration, there's a lot of room for hope, right? I mean, at the moment, we have clearly a president who's outright hostile to issues like civil rights and environmental protection. We have a governor, unfortunately, Governor Hochul, who appears to be retreating from a lot of the climate justice progress that we made from 2019 on. And so we now find ourselves with, like, what does this mean in terms of systems like mass transit? Like, how do we, when clearly over 66% of people of color use the subways, over 75% of bus riders are people of color. The median age of people, the median income of people that use buses is like $28,000 a year. So there's a clear line between how much the city relies on mass transit, who relies on it for work, hospital appointments, school, whatever, and there's a clear through line between the people that rely on mass transit and even how those disparities show up as well. So, for example, over 75% of the city's bus depots all located in low-income communities of color. And what that means is that these buses, a lot of them we fought for years, and it's still years ahead of us, the transition to electric buses. And that's going to take, we've managed to pass several budget initiatives and several local laws.
How many are electric now? How many?
Less than 5%.
Okay.
So there's a lot of that ahead of us. In the meantime, that means that these older polluting buses are concentrating and moving in and out of, again, mostly communities of color. So that's why, for example, we've been fighting for the electrification of bus depots in these communities so that we can start reducing some of the truck impacts.
Yeah.
But that's old. That's a historic exposure. What does it mean when you cite all of the city's e-commerce delivery, last mile delivery facilities, again, in the same handful of communities of color? There's been an explosion of e-commerce that we never saw coming before COVID. COVID hits, and all of a sudden we have these enormous facilities, whether it's Amazon, whether it's name some of the other FedEx or whatever, and these are now concentrated in low-income communities of color, and they're now being inundated with even more truck traffic than they had before.
Tell me about the origins of your organization and exactly what it is that you do.
It's an interesting story. We were founded in 1991 by community-based organizations themselves. NEJO, the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, is a citywide coalition of community-based organizations from the most environmentally overburdened communities in the city, which of course are also Black and Latino communities. And the way our organization came together was in the early 90s. Neighborhood leaders from the South Bronx, from North Brooklyn, from Central Brooklyn would show up at permit hearings or would show up at city council hearings because they were fighting against the siting of a transfer station or a sewage plant expansion or whatever. And these were communities that were starting to learn about this kind of infrastructure. And they would go to these meetings and often would only see a few other Black and brown community leaders from other neighborhoods. And as they got to know each other, they realized they shared a lot of the same problems and a lot of the same challenges. And they realized if we're going to fight for environmental justice, we're not going to be able to win just community by community. We need to work together in a citywide framework so that we're identifying all of the reasons why we have these disparities and finding strategies to dismantle them as much as possible. And that's where the movement became a citywide support network of local battles as well.
And it certainly seemed like in most of the local battles, the communities lost. Or did they?
It's interesting.
Has it gotten better?
They lost some and won some. So, for example, there was a time where it's still the case right now, where over 75. Again, the number 75% keeps cropping up in a lot of these studies, but over 75% of the city's entire solid waste stream is trucked in and out of 4 community boards in the South Bronx, North Brooklyn, and Southeast Queens. And so, for the longest, the communities were fighting the expansion and siting of individual transfer stations when they realized it was a systemic way to approach the problem. Should we look at how the Department of Sanitation handles its solid waste collection and, most importantly, its disposal? Where and how does it take New York City waste? And it turns out that it was running through a network of land-based transfer stations that were truck run. And we're like, wait a minute, we're a waterfront city. Why aren't we using our waterways to move the city's waste? And so 20 years ago, the Bloomberg administration adopted a radical shift in how New York City is supposed to export its waste. And now 20 years later, we're still fighting to get the marine transfer station networks up and running. But that is a huge billion-dollar victory that would not have been won if it hadn't been for the communities on the ground.
Tell me about some of your past, maybe about one of your past campaigns, maybe about one of your current campaigns, and give me some details about.
Absolutely.
About.
I would say probably the law that the movement across New York City, New York State was most proud of is getting something passed in 2019 called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It's essentially New York State's climate law. It's a mandate that by 2050, New York State needs to be on a path to 100% net zero emissions reduction. It is the most ambitious out of different states' climate laws, and it's meant to reduce not just our climate disparities, but also increase our resiliency and target it so that communities that are the most vulnerable are given the resources and support they need in order to be more resilient. Part of the problem we've been having, so it took us 4 years to get that law passed in 2019, but what's been happening is that the governor has failed to adopt a financing system in order to implement the law. And she's now done this twice. There was congestion pricing, if you remember, a year ago, was supposed to start in early July. The governor got spooked, delayed it. It wasn't until our organization and others sued her that the governor finally came around and realized that congestion pricing was the law of the state and they needed to implement it. And she did it again at the beginning of 2025. We were supposed to have something called a cap, trade, invest system where we were supposed to target polluters and use the revenues from those targeted polluters to help build out the infrastructure that we need to reduce carbon emissions, as well as put money in people's pockets. All we hear about is the need for affordability and how gas prices and everything are out of reach for people. Well, here was a system that would literally put billions of dollars into New Yorkers' pockets, and the governor, again, apparently is spooked by potential Republican attacks and has decided to delay this program as well.
Yeah.
So our work is only as good as the implementation of the chief executives.
How do you feel about congestion pricing? Because people have wide-ranging views on it.
Yeah, I will tell you, we were among the earliest supporters. Like, this was something that we, along with a lot of transit and environmental justice activists, started pressing the Bloomberg administration back in 2007. And if most people don't remember, but the first attempt to get congestion pricing passed was actually in 2009 under the Bloomberg administration. And when he was unsuccessful, we literally spent the next 10 years advocating, because there was no other way of raising the revenues we needed to make our transit and bus system anywhere near a 21st century system, right? So yeah, we spent a good 10 years fighting, and ultimately, then Governor Cuomo and the legislature came to realize there was no other revenue source they could count on. And here we are a year later, and it's a raving success. I mean,
is it? Yeah. And how is it doing in terms of reducing? Has it actually reduced car traffic in the city?
It's stunning. Yeah, not only is it reduced, like literally within the first month, something like 7%. There was like a 7% drop in traffic, which doesn't sound like a lot until you start putting numbers to it, right?
Yeah.
But congestion pricing. There have been a number of recent reports that show not only did emissions go down in the congested zone, it went down citywide. It went down for the Bronx also, which is exactly the reason the EJ activists supported congestion pricing, because these trucks and cars that are coming from the suburbs are driving through our neighborhoods to get to Midtown. And so, and not only...
And some of them are huge,
Yeah, absolutely.
huge trucks in local neighborhoods.
And for us, it was one of those systems where you're not only reducing air emissions, but the monies collected are going to go to build out mass transit, which, you have to give people options. If you're telling them you shouldn't drive, or you're charging them to drive, then they need, the incentive, and they need the access to the services in order to take buses and trains. And now that money, about $500 million, is being targeted for just some of these programs. So it's a raving success, yeah.
We touched on open space issues, how much greenery and space do people have to live their lives in?
Yeah.
How do you make more open space available to people when it seems like they're building on every empty lot in the city.
It is. It's a range of public priorities that successive mayors have done. Have had a mixed bag of success in terms of how do we. So, for example, if you look at extreme heat, most people don't know right now over 500 New Yorkers, right now in New York City, die every year from extreme heat exposure.
Is that true?
Over 500. But these are stats from the Department of City Health and Mountain Hygiene. So
Because I remember some years ago, one summer in Chicago, 600 people died from the heat. And I said, how can that possibly be?
Yeah.
But you're saying New York
over 500 every
that.
year. Now, and the thing is, like, you know, it's, some of it is our older folks with compromised health, immunity. There are a range of contributing underlying factors. But again, over 500 people a year die with these complicating factors coupled with heat exposure, right? And what's really worrisome is if you look at projections from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, by the 2050s, they expect the number of 90-degree days to double, the number of heat waves to triple or quadruple. The average summer day is going to be like 4 degrees hotter. So when you start adding all this stuff up, and you're already seeing 500 New Yorkers dying every year, their own estimates show that there's an expected 70% increase in morbidity just from heat, right? And when you look at all the different climate change exposures that people have, when you add them all up, storm surge, just other ways that people die from climate change, heat is the #1 killer of all. When you add up all climate change impacts, heat dwarfs them all. And we are now looking at a city known for urban heat island effect. We're looking at a city where, again, the disparities between which communities are physically hotter than others. For example, public housing, NYCHA residents live in 10 of the 12 hottest areas of New York City. If you look at green and open space, people of color and communities of color have 33% less total green infrastructure and park space than non-communities of color. So when you look at the kinds of systems that we need in order to reduce the urban heat island effect, to give people more of a chance at not dying early in the 2050s, then you need a range of interventions, including wildly expanding the city's amount of green infrastructure. So one of the things that we're working with is a citywide coalition that just passed a law that mandates that the city of New York has to identify a strategy to increase our green space to about 33% citywide. So it's a significant, I think, expenditure of different revenues and resources and programs that we need. But whether it's cooling centers, whether it's green infrastructure, there's a range of things the city needs to do to get New Yorkers ready for climate change, and that's just heat. Yeah.
The public housing projects, are they allowed to have air conditioning in the public?
Yeah. In fact,
Because I remember there was a time when they weren't.
Yeah, no, they have. I think that part of the problem, for example, like when COVID hit, there was a commitment by the then de Blasio administration to set aside something like 60,000 air conditioners, because we were afraid up until that moment that if you did not have air conditioning and you wanted to escape kind of like the worst of the heat, in the summer days, you'd go to a cooling center. And one of the things that we found out is these cooling centers are disproportionately cited. They're not the communities like Canarsie and Elmhurst are communities that are some of the hottest in the city, have no cooling centers, these two neighborhoods, and there are a few other ones like that. Some of these cooling centers, in fact, don't know that they are cooling centers. They're senior centers, they're libraries. So we did a survey a few years ago when we called, and some of the cooling centers didn't realize they were designating cooling centers. So whether it's cooling centers, whether it's green space, there's still a ton of things the city needs to do. And the good news is the Mamdani administration has already signaled that climate and environmental initiatives are going to be important to them. Okay,
so you're optimistic about going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at whether it's the free and fast buses or whether it's the grocery stores or whether it's childcare, all of these are components that we have all as movement people have been fighting for years to expand access to, because These are the minimum, whether it's, again, childcare, transportation, or food access. These are the kind of the basic systems that we need to lead a dignified, healthy life. And the fact that this mayor, incoming mayor, has decided to prioritize these, gives us a lot of hope.
So, environment, it's an important issue, environmental justice as opposed to a continuation of environmental injustice is an important thing for people to be focusing on.
Exactly.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'd like to thank Eddie Bautista, Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. And you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For 1-to-1 and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.